So now let's just do from 9 to 13. And our halfway position here is going to be number 11. So now here's where you got to get your brain in gear. Okay, so we're going from this position here, number 9, back to this position here. We got to do the knee buckle, right? So we're going from the heel on this point to the heel on this point. Half the distance between those two is right there. So that means my foot's going to sit in this position here, but I have to do the knee buckle. So don't lose track of what you did on the other side, because if you don't make it symmetrical on this side, your character is going to limp. So if I had just defaulted right back to halfway in between, one side I'd have a buckle, the other side he'd have a stiff leg, and he would look like he was limping. It would look bad. So what should I do? I grab my number 3 drawing. I know you were all thinking it. Here's my number 3. So the easiest thing to do here is to do the mirror. Find my vanishing point up here. There's my heels lining up. There's my toes lining up. There's my knee going through there. Okay. So my hips, remember my hips drop way down on this one? These are not going to flip properly, but see how the hips, because it's the opposite leg. But see how my hips drop down, right? So that's what I want to do on this drawing as well. I want to drop my hips, but in this drawing here, this is where this leg is forward, so I want the other leg to come forward, so therefore this hip has to be further forward over here. It's going to be parallel, but it's got to be further forward on this side, and this one has to go back slightly, parallel on that side. So this would actually go like this now. That's the appropriate action for the hips. Right? Dipping down. So now I need to find the angle on this leg here, the thigh, and match that angle to this one here, where it crisscrosses through my perspective. That's my kneecap right there. And then parallel, all I have to do is just connect my points there. There's my shin. Okay. Then on the back side here, I've got to get this line here from this hip, parallel to it. It's going to go down like that. From the knee, the vanishing point goes across like that. And there's my perspective for the knee. The shin goes across, pretty much straight across. So that's going to match up there. And then I've got to make sure that my heel goes to the vanishing point. Give me my cutoff point for my heel and the angle of the foot, matching those up and getting the tip in perspective so it doesn't look like it's shrinking. So there now are my two opposites for these two, okay, which is now the appropriate in between for these two. Okay, so that's remembering what I did on the last side and being sure that I do it on the opposite side as well. So like I said, those are the two things that I'm looking for. Number one is the smoothness of this action, that it's all even as it goes back on both sides, and it's symmetrical on both sides. Okay, so by being symmetrical, that means you have to check to find the opposite drawing and get the mirror image for it. So now I'll do number 10. So this is where I plant the foot there. This is, I slap the foot down on number 10. My knee is halfway in between those two. My hips halfway in between as they drop down. Halfway on the hip on this side. Halfway on the knee on the other side. Remember, the knee is doing that big dip thing, so we got to get that going. And the path of action on it as it loops up and over there. So this one, this is where I'm going to bring my heel to this position and the foot bends, so it's the toe bending. That's the last contact point for that foot on that side as it rolls up. Okay, so 9, 10, 11. and into 13. 12. And now it's all halfway in betweens. Halfway on my heel from here to here, right there. Halfway on my knee, going back into this position is right there. Halfway on my hip, popping up here. Halfway on the opposite side of the hip. Spine should line up. Knee swinging forward, going from here to here. It's just hidden in behind the thigh. Heel swinging forward and down to this position, favoring on the one side. Remember, we did that favor coming out of that key high point. That position there. So now going from 13, these are my final 3 in-betweens, going back into number 1. My halfway point on this is going to be number 15. Get that heel going back from here to here, half the distance on the knee, half the distance on the hip, half the distance on the other hip, spine, swinging the knee. What has to happen? Remember, it's got to go too far and come back. Right? So I'm going from this position here. I've got to swing it forward too far and then come back into it. So remember, I did the thirds on this one, so I've got to go 1/3, 1/3, which takes the knee just slightly further forward than on this one. Half the distance on the heel. Making sure I don't skim through the ground there. And 13 to 15 is number 14. We're almost done. And it's going to look so cool. Okay. Absolutes, heel to heel, half the distance, knee to knee on this side, hip to hip. Okay, so now I halfway in between on my knees from here to here, halfway in between on my heel, halfway the hip here, and then match the angle of the foot. And then into the final in between, 15 to 1. This is where my knee now pops to its farthest extreme. Here's where I want to go too far with the knee out here. Halfway in between my hips. halfway in between the knee on this side, halfway in between the foot, half of action there. Okay, let's see what it looks like now. So that's you can see the one side there with the knee buckle. If we split the stack in half, and we start off with number 7 or 8, we can see the opposite side now. See the far side knee. Okay, so that's working pretty cool. Nice swivel on the hips, good buckle on the knee, buckle. Popping the knee too far and then bringing it back just before the step. That's going to look cool. So that looks pretty good. All right, so shoot that as a pencil test and see what it looks like. I'll just show you what I did with the other class. So this is the normal walk. This one doesn't have as much of a dip to it as I did with you guys. Now there are also a number of different variations on this type of walk cycle that you can add into it, such as the position of the legs in the number 5 position. You don't necessarily have to have this one leg straight. You do have to have it in the halfway position down here, but there's nothing to say that you can't bend the leg. Have the knees here and drop the hip down in this position, so that your character is actually moving from this position to this position here. Which would then require this leg in its forward motion to be closer to the ground here. More of that type of an action. Now that's a pretty dramatic type of an action to take for the cycle, but it is possible. There's nothing to say that you can't do that, or any variation somewhere in between that. So you can see the difference between these two drawings here. Okay, that's a big dip. Now the other thing that you might want to consider is the possibility that when you're doing your cycle, you don't necessarily have to have the legs the distance apart that we had them in our original grid here. You could widen that stance, or you can close it down so it's less wide. So I could, still keeping my same perspective that's over here, I could put my tracks very close together here, which is normally what most people do when they walk, because they have their legs fairly tight in these two positions here. Or the other thing I could do would be to widen the stance. So I could take my legs out to here. Now that would create a slightly awkward walk cycle because the width of it would cause the hips to sway back and forth in this direction, side to side, in order to counterbalance whenever you took your foot off the ground. You'd have to balance that out. So again, that doesn't mean that you can't necessarily, or you could, if you wanted to, have your hips sway from side to side off that center line. So not only are they moving up and down and pivoting back and forth this way, but we could also move them side to side. Now, it does require a little bit more planning to try and figure out where everything is and why it's doing that, et cetera, et cetera. And it will affect the motion up here, obviously, because you're going to have more of a figure eight type of an action taking place. So it's just something that you have to plan out. One of the things I've been telling my students all along is that when you're doing this type of a piece of animation, what you really need to do is you need to act it out. You need to go into those positions and actually walk like this. You know, find out what it's like when you go down from this position here down into that position here. How do you get into that position? What are your different leg positions going to be? Is it going to affect, you know, the way you plant your foot and the buckling action? All these things have to be considered. Is it something that's physically possible? If it's not physically possible, then you should probably maybe choose not to do it. So think it through and act it out. It's something that you actually physically have to do in order to see whether or not it can work. And there's so many different ways of walking. I mean, you walk down the halls of your local school. If you're in a college and you're taking animation right now, just walk down the hall behind someone and watch the way they walk. Go out onto a street corner and just people watch and see how everybody has a different type of walk and a different cadence. And it's based on their body shape, their type, their height, their weight. All these things come into play when you're dealing with this type of an action. So now's the time to start observing and seeing how these things work and then planning it out on your paper in order to get it to work properly. The key thing with this assignment, though, is that you must make sure that your path of action is nice and smooth along the ground, that the increments are all exactly the same, and that your actions are symmetrical on either side. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a limp on your character, and that's what you don't want. All right?